Vice President Biden is in Georgia, in Tbilisi. He just was in Ukraine. And in both countries, he reasserted American support for the, quote, aspirations of Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. Is this different than George Bush's determination for Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO? Well, to help us unpack Biden's trip and to help us also make sense of and measure or give a score to President Obama's foreign policy over the last 6 months, we're now joined by Eric Margolyes. He's a contributing editor, foreign policy editor at the Sun newspaper chain and author of the book American Raj. Thanks for joining us, Eric.
Pleasure.
You and I don't think, have talked on camera at least, perhaps even since President Obama was elected. Give us a sense of how you think he's doing on foreign policy. I know you were hopeful he would represent a change of direction. In Biden's visit and language, do you see a change? And more generally, what do you make of Obama foreign policy?
I must say I feel a certain amount of disappointment, like many North Americans and people around the world. I was hoping for a significant change in American policy, less militant, less militarized, more cooperative. Unfortunately, while the tone and the style has improved dramatically, the actual content has been disappointing. I'm getting a sense of Bush, deja Bush, from watching what's going on. As I see it, the Obama administration not only is continuing many of the policies of the Bush administration, whether it has to do with Afghanistan and Iraq or question of torture and Guantanamo and wiretapping Americans and civil rights and this whole issue. But we see some new initiatives that are also worrying. For example, the enlargement of American military bases in Colombia, Hillary Clinton's very vocal threats against Iran, America's new alliance, military alliance with India, which is sure to bring the U.S. into confrontation at some point with China, and of course President Obama's deepening and increase of the war in Afghanistan.
Let's start with the Biden trip to Ukraine and Georgia. During the election campaign, there was some repositioning, one thought, from Obama on the question of Russia. Hillary Clinton hits this famous reset button. Is there a nuance of change of language in Biden talking about supporting aspirations to join NATO? Does that represent a stepping back from the Bush commitment of Georgia and Ukraine in NATO or not, do you think?
Not at all. I think it is a pause, a slight pause in the process. Obama did not announce the end of this incredibly stupid Bush program to put an anti-missile system into the Czech Republic and Poland, which drove the Russians crazy. It was just a totally unnecessary provocation. It was as if Russia had put in an anti-missile system in Guadalajara, Mexico. He should have done that. He didn't do that. And he is continuing the Bush administration's policy of pushing U.S. military influence into Georgia and Ukraine, Russia's underbelly, formerly parts of Russia, and into Central Asia, which all adds up to the Russians now believe that they're being surrounded by American military bases, which they are. One hopes America doesn't have hostile intent, but that's certainly the appearance that's being given.
The American argument would be that the commitment to independent Georgia and independent Ukraine, if the United States is seen to be backing down on NATO, then they seem to be backing down on the whole concept of this independence. And certainly within these countries, the public opinion, at least in the non-Russian section of Ukraine and quite widely in Georgia, there is certainly a fear of the ghosts of Russian occupation. Can the United States back off this without fueling this feeling of quote-unquote abandonment?
Well, it can and it should. I've been writing for years, ever since the Soviet Union collapsed, that the U.S. should not push NATO, which is really an expression of American strategic power, should not push NATO up to Russia's borders. It guarantees future instability and conflict and confrontation with Russia. That was Gorbachev's understanding, as I understand it, was that NATO would not do so in exchange for Gorbachev not crushing the rebellions that finally overthrew the USSR. But now by pushing NATO to Russia's borders, you've thrown down a gauntlet to the Russians. But what to do about, one also said, what to do about the Baltics and Ukraine and Poland, countries that want to escape from the shadow of Russia, and with very good reason. It's a very difficult situation. There is an answer for it, a non-provocative answer, and that is what is known in traditional diplomacy as creation of a cordon sanitaire, which means an agreement with Russia that a belt of neutral nations will be established that separates NATO and Russia, that where no Russian troops are allowed to go, that has very formal commitments from the Western alliance, so that Russia does not feel that NATO is pushing against its borders and trying to tear apart Russia and destabilize it.
Which the Russians have indicated they would support, if I understand it correctly.
A demilitarized?
A demilitarized buffer zone. I understand the Russians are in support of that.
They have said that they would favor something similar, but the U.S. is not doing this at all. Quite the contrary. American warships, when last year it's a silly war between Georgia and Russia, American warships came and were cruising in the Black Sea. Just off the Russia's coast practically, and the U.S. is sending in military trainers, as they're called, into Georgia now, and probably weapons to follow. So the U.S. willy-nilly is advancing to militarize these countries around Russia's borders.
Even in Georgia, I was there a few months ago, even in Georgia, there's a growing feeling that there needs to be normalized relations with Russia. I think a lot of people now understand Saakashvili actually provoked this Georgian war. And the other thing that came out of this last Georgia-Russia conflict in South Ossetia is that it's very obvious, in a million years, there's no way American troops are going in to save Georgia, NATO or no NATO.
Well, I keep writing. Is NATO and the United States ready to risk nuclear war for Tbilisi, Georgia? Never mind Tbilisi, Poti, Georgia, that was fought over last year? Of course not. But the problem is that Russia has thousands of nuclear warheads pointed at the United States and vice versa. America cannot afford to have any contentious issues with Russia, which holds a gun to its head. And we're kicking Russia in the shins by doing this.
Is this all about having cards to play in negotiations? But if it is, what exactly does the American want from the Russians? I guess it's all about Iran. Is that what this is really about?
It's about Iran, it's about Israel, it's about the Caspian oil basin, and it's about surrounding Russia and keeping it on the defensive. Unfortunately, this is still a very militant, forceful foreign policy that was started under the first President Bush and is continuing now. And I was just in Washington too, Paul, and people kept asking me, who is driving this policy? President Obama came in and promised all kinds of good things, yet we see more of the same. Who is really making foreign policy in Washington?
What's the answer?
I don't know yet. Ask them in Moscow and they'll say, oh, it's still the same military, industrial, imperialist, warmongering, capitalist complex. Of course, we're saying, well, it's still the old KGB and the Reds who are running things in Moscow. So we're going back into Cold War thinking very quickly.
And maybe as in the Cold War, I think most of what the Russians said about the Americans was true, and most of what the Americans said about the Russians was true. So maybe we're still in that situation.
I couldn't agree more about that. But certainly in Washington, the financial, which I put first, financial military industrial complex, about which General Eisenhower warned us, appears to be making policy. And it is not President Obama, or at least not the thoughts he expressed when a candidate.
Well, even as a candidate, one never heard him question the fundamental assumption of U.S. policy that the U.S. should strive for dominance, that the United States should be the supreme military power on earth. I think Obama expressed a somewhat more benign interpretation of that. But every time he talked about foreign policy, he always said his roots were in Truman. He talked about all the presidents from Truman on, even including George Bush Sr., So actually, I don't know why anyone thought he would really be on such a different page.
Hope springs eternal, and even I, a noted cynic, felt a few zephyrs of spring, hoping that America would stop this confrontation. Obama had the chance to stop the war in Afghanistan. He could have said, I just came into office, I don't understand this war, I'm hitting the pause button on the Afghan war till we can really review it and try and hold peace talks and see what we can do. America would have applauded him for doing that, but instead he's heightening this war, and he's very quickly tugging the U.S. into a war in Pakistan. It's a very militant policy, and though he's got Hillary Clinton running around as his sort of enforcer, it's not the America that the rest of the world wants to see. And a world opinion survey just came out that showed that the majority of people around the world still think America is using its mighty power unwisely.
Well, in the next segment of our interview, let's talk about Afghanistan, Pakistan, and President Obama's policy. Please join us on the Real News Network.